Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Minted Podcast. If this is one of the first episodes that you've listened to on this show, we want to document the journey of creators beginning to engage with NFTs in Web3. And so on most of these episodes, we're going to be bringing you stories of creators, whether they're podcasters or YouTubers or streamers, that are starting to launch their own NFT projects. Some of these projects are going to be really well established. They're going to be down the road, and we're going to be able to talk about all of these lessons. And some of them are going to be new, and we're going to be talking more about where do we see this technology going and how can we incorporate this technology with our audiences and with our communities. And so to do that, I'm really excited about today's conversation because we get to talk with Jürgen Strauss. His podcast is called the InnovaBuzz Podcast. I was really grateful to be one of his guests recently on it. And I encourage you to go check out his podcast. But I wanted to have this conversation in particular because I think Jürgen has built a community around his show better than I've seen most podcasters do. And so we're going to talk about that today. But I will stop talking and I want you to meet our guest, Jürgen Strauss. Jürgen, welcome to the Minted Podcast. How are you doing today?
Thanks, Seth. It's a privilege to be here, and I'm doing really well. Thank you.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, glad to have you here. As we've been diving into this conversation, really for me over the last year to year and a half of how can content creators use NFTs to grow their audience and to grow their revenues. The thing that I've realized is so many people want to jump into the Web3 and NFT space to make money. Maybe not now with the market so low, but especially at the peak when Bored Apes were going for almost $1 million and all this crazy stuff. People just wanted to make money. I really realized the successful NFT projects and Web3 projects, they build community and then the money seems to follow the community. I think you've built an amazing community around your business and around the podcast. So I'd love for you just to tell our listeners a little bit about your approach to community and how have you built such a strong community around your show, InnovaBuzz?
That's a great question. I started InnovaBuzz in 2014, so it's about 8 years ago. In fact, in August, it was 8 years. And after probably about 30 or so episodes, I realized it wasn't just a great way to speak to amazing people from around the world. And of course, I learned from every single one of my guests. And then I get to share that with my audience. It was also providing me the opportunity to grow my network and grow my connections all across the world because on each episode, I'd end up getting introduced to somebody that I hadn't met before, or people would refer to somebody else that I could then reach out to and say, hey, we talked about your work on this episode of the InnovaBuzz podcast. I'd like to connect and get to know you a little bit better, find out a little bit more. So I realized very quickly it was a great way to build my own community. And as an introvert, I found it very easy to network through that means. And in time, I thought it's kind of a community that's built itself, but I haven't done anything with it. So what if I brought that group together and I started running events on Zoom in the early days of the pandemic when people were longing for different ways to connect because they were locked down. They couldn't get out to public events and to networking events and meet others as they had been used to in the past. I ran these events and I facilitated some really deep and meaningful conversations with people that led to connections between some of the guests that hadn't met one another. And out of that, there developed a whole lot of opportunities. Some of it was, for example, other podcasters identifying new guests that they could bring on their show, or people who didn't have their own podcast but wanted to get on other shows, connecting with podcasters there, and so they got on other shows. There were some other things that came out of that were a little surprising to me, but in hindsight, not surprising, and that was that people started to talk about common interests and form joint venture projects out of that. And also there was some quite significant business came out of some of those conversations. And I thought, this is wonderful. I'd keep doing these events. And in time, of course, I had a lot of things on my plate, and so the events started to become less frequent, and I knew I wanted to get back to the events, and I thought, well, I haven't done one for 3 months, so I ran another one. It was, again, a great success, and I asked myself, what can I do to take me as kind of the bottleneck out of this equation a little bit and allow that connection to happen whether I'm running events or not. So I built this community on a social platform that gives people the opportunity to have those interactions. It's like a Facebook group, but not on Facebook. So it's a place where people go simply to engage with that community. It's where they go with intent. And it also automatically, there's an AI inside that automatically sends out every couple of weeks some connection suggestions, and it introduces people by itself without me getting involved once I've set it up. That's proving to be very valuable. So the whole idea of the community, and every time I have a new podcast guest on, I invite them to that community. So it's still in the early days, but it is growing, and it's starting to get its own momentum. So that's been my approach to the community, and I'm very strong on it's a community where everybody should have this idea of contributing, but there's also the concept of there's actually value to being part of that community, and there's value to engaging with that community and engaging in conversations there. And the platform's set up in a way that I can run my events inside that platform. We can do live streams inside the platform. People, when they connect, they can actually, rather than go on Zoom or Microsoft Teams or whatever to have a direct conversation once they get introduced, they can actually do that inside the platform as you might do inside of Messenger, for example.
Yeah, that's great. And I think, again, I haven't seen anybody doing it in the way that you're doing it. And so that was why it was so intriguing to me. When you and I had a conversation a couple months back, I was starting to talk about NFTs and how podcasters can use this. And then, I introduced you to Carlos Diaz, the CEO of Uncut FM. You've since launched an NFT project on Uncut FM. What intrigued you about NFTs, and what made you really want to say, okay, I want to start incorporating this into my community and into what we're doing?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've been following the whole blockchain technology from kind of a distance, and the idea of this is a way to make a lot of money. Whilst that has appealed to everybody, I guess it was a case I looked at it with a little bit of skepticism, and I thought that this is one of those bubbles that potentially can really get hurt on. So in terms of an investment, I thought, well, I'll just observe here. But the technology itself intrigued me from the point of view of some of the applications that were out there where artists, for example, were starting to use it to authenticate their artworks and to prevent forgery, for example. And I'm a keen photographer, so I thought, I wonder how that could be applied in photographs to authenticate ownership of a photograph as opposed to somebody that's just downloaded a file or taken a screenshot and used that. When you told me about your NFT project and introduced me to Uncut FM, I immediately kind of switched on a light in my mind, because one of the visions I have for my community is that in time we bring podcast listeners in, and podcast listeners will then have the privilege of accessing guests. So if we're having a conversation on the podcast and we talk about something that a listener finds intriguing, but they have still a lot of questions after we've finished our conversation, they then have the opportunity to go on the platform, engage in further conversation with you, and that may then even lead to some business for podcast guests that are in the platform. And I thought, but that has to have value. So people who are listeners need to pay for the privilege of going on there. And I was still unsure how would that work? How would I do that? Because it's something like, it's hard to put a dollar figure on that. It could have enormous value. It could have just little value if somebody is just going to be a casual member of that community. And the idea of using an NFT or a digital token to gate that community for podcast listeners really appealed to me in that sense, because I thought there's something that can be set at a very low entry cost, but the token itself has inherent value. It can be passed on, and that value of the token could grow if the value of that community starts to grow, and then also, of course, linked into what the value of the underlying asset of the blockchain is.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So initially, just kind of what you've done is, you've built this community of the guests that you've had on your podcast. And the way they get into that community is by being a guest on your podcast. But now your listeners have a chance to be a part of that community, which you mentioned it could be inherently valuable, and there could be, maybe even business or different things for the guests, or for the listeners, the audience members that buy this token, but also for the guests. That's giving me access as a listener to be able to say, wow, Jürgen just interviewed this person. Normally I wouldn't be able to contact them, but if I buy this NFT, I get access to his community where now I can go and interact with this person. Is that kind of the concept that you're trying to build?
That's right. That's exactly the concept.
How has how receptive have people been as you've told other people about it? Kind of as you've been launching this over the last month or so, what questions have people been asking? Are people excited about it? What have you been hearing?
Well, it's very early days yet, and I'm still getting my head around some of the logistics and mechanics of how it works. So I haven't been promoting it heavily. I've spoken to a number of people about it, and generally the reception has been pretty good, although most of the people, I think, don't understand the blockchain, and they're kind of scared on the one hand of, this is this is cryptocurrency. This is this is the Bitcoin.
Like a scam
Bitcoin's up and down, and you hear about well, I don't know what's it been doing today, but I think it's on the way down again. So they kind of have these negative associations with it. So I'm refining my message around the idea of, this is a digital token. So think of it, if you're buying a ticket, but this is an authenticated digital ticket that will give you access to this. So I've been focusing much more on the idea of the community and the value in the community, and then kind of tacking on to that, this is how you get access to the community as a listener.
Yeah, I love that aspect of really focusing on how can we use this technology to build communities. And again, I think money follows community. I just heard somebody on another podcast the other day talking about this concept of a Power 100, and how, thinking about, are there 100 people in your life that, they support what you do, they believe in what you do, and also you believe in what they do, and they're kind of your inner circle. You'd want to send referrals to them, you'd want to help them out, but also you'd want to give them updates in your own life. And so he has this specific process for how he's been building that. For me, I've been trying to think, I know there's people in my life that they want to know how my business journey is going. They want to know what I'm learning. And also they want to know what help I need. But that's not my whole email list. And also those people don't need to know every single week when I upload a new podcast episode. So it's interesting because I've had some of these questions around community. And now I'm realizing I'm going to launch this as an NFT project, actually, where we're going to launch a digital token, and it'll actually be password protected, and people have to ask me for the password. And then I'll send those people updates every month and say, hey, here's how we're doing in business. Here's what I'm learning. Here's what I'm struggling with. Here's what I need help with. And also, here's some of the content that's been inspiring me, or some of the connections that have been inspiring me. And people will be able to join that journey. And I think we're going to start to see more case studies and more examples of how NFTs can be used for community. Are there some other ideas that are floating around your mind, or some other use cases that you're beginning to think about of like, how else can we use this?
Yeah, actually, I've got my mini whiteboard here. There's a whole lot. I don't know whether that comes across on the camera. There's a whole lot I've been writing down there.
Hold it up again so that I can take your ideas. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, there's a whole lot there. I mean, with the podcast, there is so much valuable content there. And every now and then I go back and listen to an episode that I recorded a couple of years ago. And I'm always astounded when I do that. I mean, one of the things, of course, I listen for is, have I improved in that time? So I've done, let's say I listened to episode 200, for example, and we're up to 500 and nearly 550 now. So I think, well, in that 350 episodes, have I improved? How am I doing things now versus then? But the other thing that always strikes me is I always learn something when I listen back to those old episodes, and that was an interesting point that the guest made, or that was an interesting track we went down or conversation we had. There's so much content there that sometimes I forget and take for granted. And one of the ideas I've had is going back through selected episodes, pulling together a snapshot of content. So at the moment, we've got every single episode with its own show notes and with the highlights as we see them for that particular episode. But thinking of pulling together a theme, so let's say a theme about podcasting, the people that I've talked to about podcasting, or the people I've talked to about sales, or the people I've talked to about business mindset, and pulling together some highlights of different people as to what they've said, and inspirational quotes or insights that would be useful to people, and pulling that together as an asset that then could sit behind that digital token. That was one idea. It was sort of a summary book. Another one that intrigued me, and I read about this on one of the blogs, I think, or one of the case studies on Uncut FM, and that was proof of listening. So having a digital token that's almost like a prize that I announce at the end of the episode, and if people have listened to that part of the episode, then they have that code or that access, how they can access that NFT. And behind that one, there's some additional value, so that right. would be like a prize. And in time, that becomes an incentive for people to listen to the entire episode, because I'll randomly, it won't be at the same place on each episode. I'll randomly intersperse that so they won't know what part to listen to. They'll essentially have to listen to the whole lot. So there are a couple of ideas that I had. And then one of the obvious ones is kind of a private podcast season, which is more or less what you're doing with this Minted podcast. And that's to have episodes or content that's gated behind an NFT. So that was some of the things I was thinking of. But as I say, there's kind of about 20 or 30 boxes and scribbles here on the page. So I'm still developing the ideas.
Yeah, it's going to be really exciting to see some of these case studies come out, behind, token gated episodes. Like you said, proof of listenership. Some people are actually already doing that. That's one of the use cases that a couple of people are already doing. I believe his name is Brian Fanzo. I really want to have him on the show. So if you're listening, reach out. But he's done proof of listenership, and then, he gives people, different benefits. He gives those benefits to the people that have listened. And I think that could be really valuable as well. And, part of this show is we're minting every episode of the show. We will mint a NFT associated with the episode. And so, this episode will be turned into an NFT. By the time that it is live, you'll be able to find it in the link to this show. And there's not going to be a ton of those NFTs. there's not even a ton of utility behind these NFTs, but we want to know that you're listening and we want to know that you like the show. And so there'll probably be about 20 or 25 copies of this NFT. And the revenue between that NFT is actually going to be split between my wallet and Jürgen's wallet. Like, we're going to pay people with the revenues from these NFTs. And so I'm just excited to see how this can be utilized. And hopefully, as we consume more content, we begin to change our behavior as consumers of realizing, oh, we should be doing more things that actually benefit the hosts, that benefit the guests. So, how can we say thank you for a transformational episode? And I'm excited about it. I'd love to kind of close this episode, Jürgen, with just, help us understand what's going on in your world that you're excited about in your business, and kind of just give you a chance to give people an opportunity to, how can they find you and get more involved with the work that you're doing?
Yeah, thanks for that, Seth, and thanks for having me on the show. It's been great to sort of explore these ideas with you a little bit more.
Yeah.
So people can find me at InnovaBiz.co is the easiest place. And if they go to flywheelnation.com, that's our community, that's the best place. So either on InnovaBiz.co, you'll find a link that takes you there. You can join that Flywheel Nation through that NFT, or by getting in touch with me if you think you'd be a great guest for my podcast. I'd love to have people on that can add value to my community. I'm really excited to hit that 550 mark with my podcast. I'm sort of exploring a few things going forward with the InnovaBuzz podcast. I'm really excited by that. I'm excited by this community because as it grows, we're starting to put more things into that community and adding value to the podcast guests, because one of the things I don't take for granted the fact that somebody comes on my show for, often it's an hour conversation, and adds value. I learn a whole lot. My community learns a whole lot from that particular guest and their wisdom and expertise. And so I want to do something that continues to add value to them, but also continue that relationship that I've started with that person. So I think that podcasting is really a relationship game, and I want to continue that relationship. And inside of that community, we've got ideas for taking those events to the next level, and even providing opportunities for people to present masterclasses in that community on their area of expertise, which could again be gated behind an NFT. So there's some of the things that we're working on right now and that I'm really excited by.
That's great. Well, I'm certainly excited to follow your journey. And I encourage all of our listeners, go find Jürgen's studio on Uncut.FM. We'll link to your show, your website, and your NFTs in the show notes. Jürgen, thank you so much for joining us on the Minted Podcast.
Thanks, Seth. It's been fun to have a conversation.
Absolutely.